Hello, I'm Sophia. Welcome to another episode of Taboo Tuesday. On Taboo Tuesday, we talk about taboo topics with hopes to have conversations that require us to be vulnerable and therefore form more connections with our communities. Thank you, Brene Brown, for that idea. I am a mobility specialist, a meditation teacher, and yoga instructor. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm not sure where you're listening or watching this, but you can listen and watch this on Instagram TV, YouTube, and coming soon wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you enjoy this conversation, this idea, you're welcome to like, follow, comment, subscribe, whatever the thing is for whatever the thing you're on. This week, I'm super excited for our conversation. I'm talking to a friend that I met online years ago named Steven, based in New York. And this week, we're talking about therapy. So hello, Steven. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah, I was thinking as you were saying that you're a mobility specialist, I'm like, I'm a mobility specialist too, but usually I don't use that language and I just call myself a personal trainer. But then when I call myself a personal trainer, everybody who knows what I do says like, you're not a personal trainer, because most people just consider personal trainers to be like counting sets and reps and telling you that like, you suck and you need to do more of something and like put more weight on the bar. So yes, I'm a mobility specialist and a personal trainer. I do a lot of kettlebell work with people, body weight strength, mobility. And I teach voice actually, which is something I don't talk about because I always felt like it was too much to put on the gram. But that is something that I still do and still love to do. So that's most of what I spend my time doing with my people.
Yeah, I knew you were into voice and singing, and I love seeing the clips of you singing. You always look so joyous. I actually didn't even know that you were also a voice teacher.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
Yeah.
And I think like in my mind, I mean, maybe it's because I'm another mobility specialist, but I feel like vocal coaching and body coaching are like very similar and have a lot, in there about like core bracing and like, I'm not going to lecture the teacher here, but yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me, at least as far as like connecting all those ways
Totally.
of teaching.
And what's great about the voice thing is that usually I use it more, like I use the voice thing more as like a spiritual and emotional tool to like help people unlock whatever is stuck for them. So obviously there's still a lot of technicalities to it. Like you need to sing on pitch and like, have a nice tone where like your vocal cords are coming together and it's not super breathy. But like, besides that, it's really like more about the heart and like opening up and sharing. So I sort of come at the voice thing from like an emotional perspective. So like, I'm not talking about like, whatever the breath needs to be doing, for the most part, a little bit, but it's not what's most interesting to me about working with people on their voice. So I'd say I'm more of a vocal coach than a voice teacher, and I'm like a teacher of the body because I will get super technical into all that with people.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. I love hearing how people describe what they do, especially in like the body mind world space that has so many different ways you can learn about your body and your mind. So with that being said, let's get into talking about therapy. So I reached out to you and I've heard you talk about a lot of cool things that I think could be perhaps topics on this show, and you suggested therapy to me. So why therapy?
Well, the second I saw that it was Taboo Tuesday, I noticed that like every time I post something about being in therapy, there's this little fear that comes up in me that I'm thinking like, is everyone going to sit there and think, oh, wow, what's wrong with Steven that he's been in therapy? I'm very proud of, and I'll like often say I've been in therapy over 10 years. I think it's been 11 years at this point. I started in 2009. Yeah. And so there's always that fear of like, should I not be saying this thing about, being in therapy? because it feels like something that we're not supposed to talk about, you know? So I just wanted to like continue to break that stigma against like, if you're in therapy, something must be like inherently very wrong with you, and that like you must have lots of, you know, deep psychological issues that like, you know, that you need to like figure out before you, I don't know, go be a person. You know, everyone has deep psychological issues that they're working out and figuring out. And it's a matter of if you're willing to like step into the fire and do the work to unroot all of that psychological trauma of just like being a human being, you know? So it's like so important to me that people are not considering therapy to be this like thing for somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's so valid. I think I too have had like stuff come up when I'm like, do I want to tell this person I'm in therapy? Do I not want to tell them I'm in therapy? And like, it doesn't need to be a big deal, right? Like, there's all sorts of reasons that people go to therapy. And when a friend tells me that they're in therapy, I'm like, wow, I'm so proud of you. Like, whatever reason that you're going to therapy, I think it's a valid reason. And to me, I consider it like we're both trainers for the mind and the body. And I think like it's like going to see a trainer to help with your stuff up here, to help with your brain stuff. And exactly like you said, we all have our stuff. Like we all have traumas and, you know, icky stuff and emotions, right? Like you can't get away from having emotions as a human.
Hopefully you're not trying to.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's like a whole other thing. Like I'm sure we've all been in that place where we're like, I don't have to feel things.
Yeah, right. And that's the whole point really of therapy. I posted about this, like this was my last post about therapy. It was like the biggest thing that therapy has given me over 10 years is to just stop and be like, wait, how am I feeling right now? Like, oh, okay. I feel kind of nervous. Like right now, I feel like kind of nervous to like be having this conversation with you, to like, I know it's being recorded, you know, I know people are going to listen. So like, there's this like sort of like looming, like very like subtle undercurrent of anxiety about the whole thing. And it's like, oh, well, if I like sit here and take a breath and like say that, okay, that's what I'm experiencing right now. And then I can be like, well, why am I experiencing that? Well, you know, I know that people are going to listen to this, and that kind of makes me nervous because like, what if, you know, like I said, what if someone thinks that I'm crazy or something like that? Then it's like, oh, well, you know, fuck that, you know, and if someone does, like, that's fine. And, you know, the whole thing can just sort of get dissipated, or like, uh, what's the word when you like undo a bomb?
Oh gosh, words.
Like undetonated.
Yeah, it's like conflict resolution. I don't know. There's a word for it.
So I've resolved the conflict in myself by just sitting here and asking myself, well, how am I feeling right now? You know,
Mhm.
which is the opposite of what we would be doing if we were trying to hide from our emotion, right? So in 10 years of therapy, the biggest thing has been, well, Steven, how are you feeling right now? Stop hiding from how you're feeling. Stop going up here, right? Sink into your heart, feel into your body, and ask yourself, how are you feeling? From there, you can ask yourself why.
Mhm.
That's been the greatest gift that therapy has given me, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's like it's so simple but so complicated, right? It's like one, having the ability to be honest with yourself and accept what you're feeling, because feelings, you know, they can be super great, they can also be super uncomfortable and super painful to sit with, and acknowledging like I am feeling blank. I am feeling nervous or anxious or happy. And I think one thing that I'm trying to do now in my life is, I think sometimes at times in my life when I'm not doing well, I'm feeling depressed, I try to focus more on like the anxious or the fear or the anxiety, but also noting like I feel happy, I feel energized. Like I'm personally working on doing that for like seemingly positive and seemingly negative emotions. But yeah, that's almost like step one, like you said. And then realizing, okay, now that I have acknowledged that I have this knowledge, what do I want to do about it? Do I want to go distract myself because it's too hard? Do I want to sit with it? Do I want to journal? Do I want to go for a run? Like, you know, endless options there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. So we had last week we had a really good conversation about therapy that actually led to me having some action items with my own therapist. But I thought it was really, really interesting that you talked about having conversations with people, normalizing, like, if you need therapy, it's totally fine. Like, there's a lot of options. And then getting into, okay, let's say you're sitting down for your first therapy session with a new therapist. Let's say I'm your friend and I'm like, I'm nervous about this, Steven. This is my first therapy appointment. What's going to happen? What should I do?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that you're alluding to in last week is when we were talking is like the hardest thing for people to do. Like, obviously, you know that when you go to that first therapy session, your job is to tell the therapist why you're there, right? And like, so you're probably going to like tell them about your life story and like whatever childhood trauma you had and like whatever issues you have with like whatever it may be, whatever problem you're having. But then once, and you know, that's exhausting, and I understand why people wouldn't want to do that. You know, shopping for a therapist sounds terrible, and it kind of is, which is why it's like normally best, if you can, to go to a therapist who like has been recommended to you by somebody who's referred. But eventually, once you're in the therapy for like, you know, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, like the therapist is probably going to say stuff to you that triggers you, that's like upsetting to you in some way. And the hardest thing for so many people, and I get it because it used to be very hard for me. I'll be honest that it's not that hard for me anymore in the context of therapy, but like to tell the therapist that what they said upset you and triggered you and you wish that they didn't say it, or you know, just being real with your therapist about the relationship between the two of you, that is the hardest thing for many people to get a hold of. And so I think that's what you were referring to when you know, when we had this conversation last week, where I was like, well, you know, and this happens all the time. People stop therapy because their therapist either said something or did something that they weren't okay with. But rather than go back to therapy and talk the therapist through what happened, they just stop, you know? And that's like literally that's like the antithesis of being in therapy. The therapist is supposed to say stuff or do stuff that upsets you. And then your job is to like meet that with consciousness and, you know, try to have as much bravery and courage around the thing that you can, you know? Mm-hmm. So I'm like constantly encouraging people to stay in therapy or get back into therapy, because usually the reason why they've stopped has something to do with what the therapist said, or it wasn't working. You know, the technique the therapist used wasn't working. Okay, that's fine. Did you tell the therapist what they said and did wasn't working? Well, no, that's just the way they work. We lost your video. There you go.
Yes, my thing popped up on my phone there. Sorry about that. I'll cut that out.
Good. You know, like they'll say like, it wasn't working. The therapist's technique didn't work for me. Oh, okay. Well, did you tell the therapist that their technique didn't work? No, that's just the way they are. Well, it's like, that's literally, you're paying them so that you can go in and say anything you want. So if you have to think of it as like, you're paying them so you can like punch them or like shit on them, that's what you're doing. If you have a hard time shitting on people or punching people, which a lot of people do, then like, this is why you're paying this person, so that you can go shit on them, you know? Obviously, at a certain point, that becomes a defense mechanism, right? So like, I'm at the point where I need to not shit all over my therapist, because it's just like, that's just me. I can do that very easily. Again, that's just me like going around in circles. But for a lot of people, like just saying to the therapist, this isn't working for me, that's really hard.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This is exactly what I was alluding to. And I think it made me think of times where like I've seen like a variety of therapists. I'm jealous that you've seen the same therapist for so many years. That's like ideally a more ideal situation, I guess. But for all sorts of reasons, people switch therapists, and that's totally fine. It makes me think of times in my life where I've been in therapy and exactly that has happened, right? I'm like, maybe like something is said and I'm deeply uncomfortable, or maybe I'm offended. And then I'm just like, so like, I think there's maybe something about the power dynamic, thinking like, oh, I'm paying this person, they must be so wise, like they could never actually like legitimately offend me, or they could never actually like do something that would make me feel uncomfortable. And it's like, of course they could, they're a human. Like therapists are human too. This makes me think about the episode on like teachers are students too. It makes me think about the episode, I did a whole episode several weeks ago about feedback and giving and receiving feedback. And this is hard for like, especially hard for giving feedback to your therapist, but like it's applicable to like giving feedback to your friends, right? Like you don't always have to give feedback, but in times, especially when you're paying somebody a lot of money to be your coach, if you're not having a good relationship with that coach, you have all sorts of options, right? You can just stop seeing them and drop everything. That's probably not going to teach a lot of people a lot of things. And if you're like, ideally you like a lot of things about your therapist, and just like any other human, they should be able to accept feedback. And another thing we were talking about is perhaps things to do in a first session, like you said, talk about why you're there. And then this like isn't not at all means mandatory, but like I thought it was an interesting thing, perhaps if you're trying to practice on giving people feedback, if you're shopping around for a therapist, it would be interesting to give them some sort of feedback and see how they react. And realize when you're giving somebody feedback, you're giving them an opportunity to react. Because so often our brains will tell us these stories, right? Like if I say this, then my therapist is going to get angry, or like they're going to think I'm stupid, or yada, yada, yada. And you can't predict the future. I can't predict the future. You're not going to predict the truth.
What's really interesting about that, giving the person feedback, if that is too much of a jump for you to go in and just like say, I'm going to give this therapist feedback like the moment I go in there, you could just ask them, how do you deal with feedback? Like in that first interview with the therapist, you could say like, how do you deal with an issue when there's something between you and your patient client, right? So there's not this like automatic assumption that like everything is always going to be perfect between you two. It like, I think like you said, it's a relationship. It's not going to be perfect. So you could just ask the therapist, how do you deal with that conflict, right? If it's too much for you to just like bring up conflict. I'm not suggesting that people bring up conflict when there is no conflict. Like if everything is cool, leave everything to be cool. For the most part, like at some point, it's not going to be. So you could ask them how they deal with it. So I wanted to just say that I had an experience. Well, I've had many experiences with my therapist of 10 plus years of dealing with this thing. But what's great about him is that he taught me how to do that with other people. So I actually went to another therapist a few years back to get another perspective. And that therapist was not as experienced and was not as like able to handle my saying that, he said something that upset me. So there was one day where I came in and I said, I didn't say this last week because it was really hard for me to say, but I just want to let you know what you said to me last week. It felt really wrong. And it really upset me. And, I'm expecting this therapist to do what my therapist of 10 years has done, which is be like, wow, thank you so much for telling me that. I can see how what I did upset you. Like, let's talk about that through. And if it was really wrong, like, I'm really sorry about that. No, this therapist, like, basically got super defensive and was not able to take what I was saying. And it actually ended with me just leaving the office. And I said, look, if you can't sit here and talk with me through what's going on between us, and without you getting defensive and like kind of putting it back on me, I'm not going to do this, And he was at a loss for words. And I was like, wow, I'm leaving, That is terrifying to me for other people, because I know what a good therapist is like. I know what a good therapist does and how they handle that situation. And now that I've seen what less experienced maybe, or just less empathetic or less open people, how they handle that, it terrifies me for other people, because I don't want that to be somebody's experience when they go into a therapist's office and say, what you're doing is not working for me. Like, we need to talk about this. So as strong, or like as championing I am of you going into a therapist's office and saying, like, your technique is not working for me, or what you said to me last week didn't work for me, I also know that, like, that might not end well. And that can be really hard, because you go in there giving this person your heart, and you expect them to hold it with care. And if they don't, it can be really hard.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. That sounds like it would have been very difficult. And yeah, that it makes me think about like any sort of coaching situation, whether it's like a therapy or a nutritionist or a coach like we are, a yoga instructor, kettlebell instructor, anything. I think all teachers in general, if you bring something up that maybe doesn't work for you, I think as a teacher, we need to be able to have those conversations and understand that, like, maybe we did something that is wrong, and that's okay, right? Like, we're not perfect. So I think that is so powerful, and takes so much emotional intelligence and energy to have those conversations with people. But when we're able to hear people and respect their truth of like, this hurt me or this affected me in a difficult way, being like, that is your perspective, that is very valid, let's talk about it, and let's see if we can get to a place where we can continue to work together, or maybe that's not the best person to work with, and like, that's okay too, right? There's lots of therapists, there's lots of trainers, there's lots of teachers out there, and not every teacher is going to be for you, and that's probably a good thing, because like, as a therapist, as a teacher, as anything, like, if you're trying to teach to every single population, you're not going to be very good at anything either. So
yeah, absolutely. This is definitely the heart. Again, it just goes back to the relationship. For me, as a trainer, as a coach, as a teacher, that is the thing that I'm constantly trying to get my people to do, which is like, talk to me about how are you feeling about the work? How are you feeling about our relationship here? Because our relationship is actually, it doesn't sound like it's really important, right? I'm here teaching you about your body, the way your shoulder moves, whatever. Why would that relationship be important? But it's actually kind of everything, right? The only reason you're here in the first place is because you like me. There's 15 million other people who you could train with. The only reason you're here is because you like me. If I do something to make you not like me anymore, do you think it's best to just leave and go find someone else who you like and wait until they do something that makes you not like them anymore and then leave again, right? Like you said before, what are you learning? Or do you say, hey, what you just did makes me hate you. I'm like really pissed off at you right now. And I'm like, yeah, shit. Like, okay, let's deal with that. Like, did I do something wrong? Or do you need to be pissed off right now? And is that okay? And is there is there a middle ground there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And like, now, even like hearing you say that, I think about like times with close friends of mine or with my family where I have to say like, hey, that thing that you said or did, like, I really, like, that did not sit with me well, or that really offended me. And like, the ability to do that, like, often at the end of the day, it brings you closer together. And often in cases that I've experienced, it's sometimes just miscommunication. So maybe like one thing comes out of my mouth and it goes into your ears in a much different way than it came out of my mouth. And that's just how our brains work too. So yeah, sometimes a really, really well-intentioned statement can translate into other ears, into other things, and maybe it was just poor communication, or maybe it was really a fundamental difference, and you got to part ways. And I think it's also scary being open to that idea, right? Because if you were to say something right now that I was just like, you know, there is a possibility that when you confront people, or maybe confrontation is too big of a word there, but when you voice these things, there is, like you said, the possible outcome of you learning that you don't want this person in your life. And that can be really painful and hard, but you know, in the long run, like, you're probably better off for it. And you know, there's so many outcomes that can come from these things, but I think usually in the long run, they're pretty good outcomes.
I think, honestly, more than the confrontation ending with you being like, oh wow, we have just like this fundamentally different way of seeing the world, so this isn't going to work for me. I guess that could be it, but to me, that almost misses the point, which is that, like, it's actually more important that even if you have a fundamental difference of the way that you see the world, you can still work together, because that could actually enrich your learning experience. What you can't work with is someone who's unable to have a give and take about that. If they're going to get defensive when you bring something up about the different way you see the world, if they're not going to be open to, then you got to go probably. But if it's just a fundamental difference of the way you see the world, which sounds massive, like, you know, you see red, I see blue, I don't even think that's necessarily a reason to end the relationship. And that goes for anything, right? It goes for partnership, it goes for friendship. Like, tons of friends who we just see things differently. And it's like, wow, really? You see it like that? I do not. And they're like, yeah, I do. If in that conversation, they're like, and you're an idiot, or like, go fuck yourself, that's a reason to leave. But just because we see things differently, you know, it's very like for people to just leave that relationship. And I think the much harder choice is to stay and like sift through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I entirely agree with that. Like the value and, you know, everything that goes with having friends with different ideas and opinions, and seeing different things in different ways is so helpful and enriching, and not always easy. So yeah, thank you for adding that in, because I definitely agree. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to part ways, if you both are like okay with sitting with differences, and you know, we all have so many of those. So learning to sit with that and learning to talk about that, despite all of the stuff that comes up in our bodies and brains, is very helpful indeed.
I think you probably like encapsulated this whole conversation best by saying, like, it's confrontation and communication. And that's basically the crux of any relationship, and goes the same for teacher student and therapist client, therapist patient. It's confront the issue, communicate how you're feeling, and like take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Man, I feel like I'm having a little mini therapy session with you right now. Like taking notes, like, gotta do this, gotta do that. This is lovely. This is so great, Steven. I'm just like looking at the notes here and see if there's anything that we haven't touched on yet. Is there anything else, any other directions, ideas, things that you're wanting to continue with here?
I don't have the notes up, but is there anything that I missed that we were going to talk about that we haven't talked about yet?
We haven't talked a ton about, I guess we have talked a little bit about helping people get into therapy. You already touched on helping people, like how to get a therapist, I think is really difficult. I've for months been like, oh my gosh, how do I get a therapist? I have insurance. Like, Psychology Today is one resource that I found helpful. But then I think one thing that you mentioned a little bit ago was actually getting a referral. So if you have a friend that has a therapist that they like, you can ask them to ask that therapist, do you have other therapists that you could refer to me based on my insurance or my non-insurance price range? Is there anything more you'd want to add for that?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Awesome. And actually one last thing that I wanted to mention, I couldn't remember the name of this when we last talked, but it's called the illusion of transparency. So basically it's the concept that we think that people really close to us know what we want, right? It's like, I think I gave the example like, oh, like Steven must be able to read my body language. He must tell that I'm so sad. So like, how on earth does he not know that I want to hug right now? Like, oh my gosh, I'm so angry that he, and that's a pretty silly situation, but could be very real. And just remembering that your therapist, your friends, your family, everybody around you, nobody can read your mind no matter how well they know you. And I think I've found myself in those situations where I think if I say this, then they'll say that. But like if I say this, then they get to react, and they might surprise me, and people often surprise me.
It's very easy to sit here and be like, I really need a hug from him right now. And him not know that, because like when we're babies, your parents must know what to do with you. You would die if they didn't. If you sat there crying and nobody fed you, you're dead. That's it. When you're a toddler, same thing. Then you're like whatever comes after toddlerness. And like you start to be able to say like, I'm hungry. Okay, well then we need to give you food. So, but the problem is that we end up being adults and we still feel like babies. We still feel like infants, because like, of course we do. That's how we came into this world, right? So it's like we want people to just be able to read our mind and say, oh, he's hungry, he needs to eat, or he needs a hug. But like, we're not babies anymore, and we have to remember that. And that's like a constant my hair. That's like a constant struggle that I think every adult is having all the time, which is like, how can I be more of an adult in this situation and remember that I'm not a baby anymore? So I need to say what I need to say, right? And can I do it in a compassionate way that is not going to be like, that is not going to stir a fight, If I need a hug, it's not like, fuck you, you don't see what I'm doing, like, give me a hug. It's like, oh, wow, I realize I need a hug. And it's really hard for me to say that because it's a really vulnerable thing to ask for a hug. But like, that's what I need from you right now.
Yeah. And like bringing this full circle to one of the first things we talked about, to be able to verbalize what you need and what you want from other humans, you need to take that time and pause and check in with yourself, right? Because like one example that I can think of, like my kitchen is really small, and when there's a lot of people cooking in the kitchen, I get really stressed and anxious. And like sometimes when I'm stressed and anxious, I find it difficult to use my words. So I'll just be like, nah, and like I'll be trying to ask somebody to move their pot, but I literally can't even get my words out. And then people get confused and it gets more hectic. So like if I'm able to take a breath, realize I'm anxious, there's a lot of people in the kitchen right now, I need to be conscious and use my words for what I want and ask for that, because that's hard, and that can be hard in all sorts of situations. So yeah, taking a second, understanding, what am I feeling, what do I need, what do I want, and how do I communicate that in a way where people will actually hear me when I say that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, oh my gosh, this episode makes me so happy.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'm so glad we're having this conversation. I hope you others out there in the void are enjoying this as much as we are. Again, you can see our beautiful faces and watch this on YouTube and IGTV. You can listen to our beautiful voices coming soon on where you listen to your podcasts. If you have any ideas for topics that are taboo, you can spin a lot of topics into being taboo in all sorts of ways. So if you have any ideas for that, you can reach out to me on Instagram, Facebook, wherever you can find a way to reach out to me. And please like, subscribe, follow, all those fun things. Share it with a friend if you want. And I'm not going to tell you who's coming up next week because it is a surprise. And I think that's it for the outro. Anything else you want to add, Steven?
No, if anyone is looking to find me, they can find me on Instagram, and that's Hey, I'm Steven Kane, HeyImStevenKane. I have a StevenKaneTraining.com website, StevenKaneTraining.com. I have a membership where I work with people every day of the week, 5 days a week. So that is something that happens. That is a training membership. Mobility and strength, kettlebell stuff as well. And obviously do private work with people all the time. And some yoga classes, some yoga, mobility, whatever you want to call it, classes happening as well. So there are lots of ways to train with me. And I would just say that if people were to end up training with me, and I assume with you, Sophia, as well, that like when something comes up that is hard for you to deal with your teacher, with your guide, to like see if you can, let them know, hey, that was really hard for me. It doesn't need to be a fight. I like the word confrontation, like confront the person, but like let there be a communication there. So yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. We welcome your feedback as coaches, and we can both learn a lot. I always say that I learn so much from my students, and they ask questions that I would never think of sometimes. And sometimes my answer is like, I don't know, I'm going to go research that. Let's figure that out together. All sorts of perspectives teach us all sorts of wonderful things. And yeah, definitely check out Steven. I have not taken a class from you yet, but I really want to. Hopefully that'll happen sometime in the future.
Right now, the yoga class that I'm doing is Wednesday at 10 a.m. and Fridays at 5:30 and 6:45 p.m. So if you want to like see how I bring FRC stuff into yoga, then you can come check that out, Sophia. That would be fun to have you.
Yes, I would love to, because we both do the same thing, like the merging of mobility and yoga, whatever that may mean to you out there listening. All right, yes.